Hi everybody, welcome to the 5th Western Bart podcast. This is really exciting because we've actually got our first non-fiction text on tonight. And compared to all the previous ones, it's slightly less bleak as well. So it should be a really different type of podcast for you all this evening. And we have really delightfully got on the wonderful Miss Rogerson, who is going to tell us a little bit about the book that she chose.
Yeah, I've chosen Airhead by Emily Maitlis, and I came across it about this time last year, and I was looking at buying Michelle Obama's book.
Ooh, yeah.
And this was sat next to it in the bookshop, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna read that. I can read Michelle Obama's book anytime.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read that, and it's a really interesting series of chapters about different interviews that she's done with lots of people with varying levels of fame, and what she thought, how she approached it before and after the reception, and why she chose to ask the questions that she asked, or what she did when she got the reaction that she got. Really easy read, actually, and I started it and just devoured it, couldn't put it down.
It's
really enjoyed it,
isn't it? Because I think most people picked it up expecting it to be an autobiography, but you're right, it is almost a collection of like short stories, her kind of events of life, isn't it, which makes it particularly quick to get through but really engaging.
Yes, and you learn little snippets about her and her life and the type of thing that she likes to do, or she gives you insight to what she's doing when a major event happens, and how she's got to drop her life and go across the world, or drop her children and run across London. And that's quite interesting, how a woman balances all the family and a very important job that she has.
And it's interesting, isn't it, because we forget, I think, because we're so often used to seeing her on these kind of well-catered news programs, that actually most of the news role jobs are so reactionary, like you said, to events that have occurred or sudden incidences that are around the world or in this country. Which is
you
why
just happen to be in the right
pacey again.
If you're in the right place at the right time, with stories about Hong Kong, and she's in the right place in the right time, and you go there and you find out about that.
She's really a really well-renowned journalist, though, isn't she? Which I think is why her book's also quite popular. What did you particularly value in her as not just as a journalist, but also as a kind of writer now as well? What made you pick up her book?
Well, I think the variety of people that she's interviews, and how thoughtful she is about how she's very intelligent interviews. So she's able to Tony Blair and Donald Trump and to Piers Morgan, to when she goes off to interview, is it the Chippendales, or is it
yeah, she does have quite an odd one in there as well, doesn't she?
Yes. And yeah, Me Too and the Chippendales is one of the chapters, to Russell Brand and she and people, because she goes and she covers the Grenfell Tower. And I always feel that when you're watching Newsnight and you're watching her, she wants to get to the truth of something, or wants to find out somebody's version of the truth of something, and she's interested in the subject that she's interviewing, and the subject as in the person, and the subject as in the topic.
She almost doesn't feel like she's sometimes prepped for it, not in a disorganized manner, but like you said, almost as if she's just there by chance and conversing with them, rather than in this kind of forced interview situation.
Yes, but then you read the book and you realize that there's lots and lots of preparation going into it. And do you ask, Bill Clinton, do you ask about Monica Lewinsky, Sheryl Sandberg? Do you ask about Facebook and fake news? Do you ask the questions that everybody expects you to ask when you have that person in front of you, or do you stick with what they expect? And some people that she's done that from, and then the Bill Clinton, she kind of got blindsided, so she wasn't able to. Donald, I love the chapter on Donald Trump. I'm thinking, what are you doing putting this chapter first? But it was really important to be first. I think the first time she gets blindsided by him, she's thinking, "What? Hang on, I don't think that what you're saying is true." The second time, I really don't think what you're saying is true. Right. The third time, I'm going to do my research on this, and I'm going to press you on it. So I'm not having this. And then he's like, well, I'm not speaking to you anymore.
We're done now.
Yeah. And I thought, well, that's that really good example of, hang on, I'm not going to have this. I'm going to challenge you. I'm not going to accept, just because you're Donald Trump, that if you say something that it's true, I'm going to challenge you.
And I like
and
the fact
obviously
that
he
she's
wasn't having any of it.
Yeah, and like you said, she's so willing to go away and contemplate these issues both empathetically and intelligently, and then go back to some of these interviewees and address something that she wasn't happy with before, or that she felt was dodged before, without coming across as this kind of almost too pushy with it or too deliberately controversial. And I think part of that for me is that she comes across as quite compassionate, but and you mentioned earlier how intelligent she is, and I think there's this really interesting message in the book about being a woman in that kind of working environment, but generally as well, as you said earlier, dropping the kids off and running off to work, about how she worries quite a few times about her appearance on TV. And I think there's an instant where she's like covered in goat dung when she's in the middle of nowhere, and she's like, I can't go on TV looking like this. I can't get recorded like this. But she still manages to get past all these kind of what would be deemed, I think, quite shallow issues, but very realistic issues, and be this incredible news figure. But there's also been all these ridiculous comments about the length of her skirt on TV a few times as well. So do you think there's an issue with women in the news in this regard, or do you think that's just stuff that she's experienced and she's picked up on, particularly because of the way that she looks, this idea of the kind of blonde attractive one, for instance?
I think there's always going to be, I suppose it happens to women, doesn't happen so much to men, because there you go, wear a dark suit, and if you have an exciting tie, it might get commented on. Whereas long skirt, short skirt, trouser suit, jacket, no jacket, bright coloured dress, don't often see men in a bright red or bright pink suit. And you have that with women, and makeup and earrings and jewelry that you don't have. So there is that variety in how women appear, and therefore there is an angle at which people can attack if they want to, and of course people do there, especially when you get onto social media now, and you can always find somebody who's going to say something, a troll really, or somebody who's another journalist that's trying to sell a newspaper, that they know that if they print some column inches attacking Emily Maitlis, and because there's a lot of people who don't like her, because of what she might demolish your favourite political person, look like she's taking a particular political stance because she's anti whoever is in front of her. She's trying to get something out of them, and therefore it's an easy thing to pick on, to attack her for. But I don't get the impression from the book that she obviously thinks about her appearance, and she reflects on what people say about her, but the reflection is more to do with how she's performed in the interview, and how the interview is received, and that intellectual level, rather than the aesthetic level of what she looks like. Although, there's mentions of directors saying, no, you must go outside, we're not going to have to do this interview in this place, but she doesn't seem to worry about that.
And it's interesting, I think, because she touches on the way that of course she worries about these things, everybody worries about them, men and women, and simultaneously, like you said, doesn't care at the same time, but she's so often the one that's picked on for that. And it's because it seems so performative, doesn't it, to be a female newscaster, I think, in many ways, the idea of the hair and the makeup, but actually it's just part of the same structure that a man goes through, but maybe just a more creative version of it, essentially.
Yes. And it isn't fair, No. And I don't know I haven't paid much attention to how it's all going at the moment, where people can't get to the hairdressers, and you've got to do your own makeup and everything like that if you're going on the television.
That's a good point, actually. I hadn't even really thought about that, if there's like more concern behind the scenes because they're having to consciously design themselves a little bit more, which would be a really interesting thing. We should reduce this further, I think. There's a really interesting point as well, actually, where she's, like you said earlier, she's so reflective on the interviews that she does, and how she kind of constructs them and has to go back over them, that she mentions about how she worries that sometimes news might oxygenate and spread the words of the wrong people. and people that you maybe don't really want airtime to or more importance to. What do you make of that concern with news in general? Do you think that we should limit who's on TV, or that no matter how problematic they should get out there?
I think it's very difficult on both sides, because you've got a news programme that you have to fill. Mm-hmm. And what if the person that you'd really like to interview on this topic isn't available, and the more controversial figure, and you've got to talk about Brexit or COVID or what have you, and the person who's available to fill the 5-minute segment is somebody who's controversial.
Yeah. And what get the viewers as well, often as well, isn't it? It's
yes.
That kind of deliberate mongering.
Especially in the print media, where they have a very obvious political slant.
Yeah.
Well, they're going to print columns from people and give the opinions of people, or headlines that are showing you the opinions of people that are reflecting what you think will sell the newspaper. And then the BBC have this. It's a scientific side of it, where I see it the most as being a scientist. The BBC has it where they have to have balance. So and they've reduced this. I went to a talk by Professor Steve Jones, where he was helping the BBC, because if you've got something that's a scientific fact, they would bring on somebody that would have an opposite opinion. Yeah. So you'd be talking about evolution and going, it's a theory of evolution. Well, it might not. No, theory in science means that we believe it. And then they bring on somebody else who's got the opposite opinion, and therefore it creates, by trying to create balance, it makes it feel like, well, it's a 50-50 choice whether you believe in evolution or not. And when you come to political opinions, that's even more difficult to work out. Well, who is right, and free speech and everything. So it is who do you give importance to? How do you create balance? And it's something that news outlets really don't get right most of the time. But I think it's just an impossible task.
And it's tricky, you're right, because as well, you mentioned the idea of free speech. Like, we can't kind of muzzle people, can we? There is this kind of free speech argument. Anyone can be recognised for their views and opinions, but that idea of balance, I think you're right, there is sometimes what's the most problematic, because we don't actually offer a balance. They offer these huge controversies and huge conflicts which don't really get anyone anywhere often.
Or the government. So somebody will come up and the unions will say something about schools, and the government will say, we've put more money into education than ever before. But what they fail to say is there's more children in education than ever before. And then you think,
that we get,
yes. So that's.
Sorry, I was going to say on that note, actually, that idea of the limit of facts and almost factual bias in that way, that kind of what is revealed on news is really key, and something that most people do need to be more informed of. So thank you for raising that one. And she does mention in her book the idea about imperfect news, and how any type of news, whether or not it's live recorded or otherwise, is always just a snapshot of a particular moment in time. I wonder if you feel that, and she doesn't touch on this too much in her book, but I wonder if you feel that this is more or less of a problem with social media and 24-hour global news. Do you feel that we get a better view as time goes on, and we're able to kind of more socially develop, or do you think it's more dangerous that way?
I think it can be more dangerous because there's not time to react or stop or think if you've got 24-hour news. So something comes forward and then it's broadcast, and then it must be true, and it might be true, but it might not be the whole picture. So I think it is problematic, although it does mean that a story can evolve and change over time, so you can get more of a fuller picture. And of course, they're trying to fill 24 hours of news. So they've got to go and find it. They've got to keep investigating. They've got to keep finding new aspects of the story, keep the story evolving to keep something going on the news. Otherwise, I know when I listen to Radio 5 a lot, and when there's not much news going on and it's the same thing that's repeated hour after hour, they're trying to expand it, and that causes its own dangers, because they'll go, well, we need another opinion on this, and we'll get somebody who's just phoned in general public, and they give you
Yeah.
something completely mad, and you're going, well, it's fine, it's their opinion, it's the opinion of a member of the general public, but it's been given airtime on the BBC, so it
Yeah.
sounds as if it's official.
It's funny how public news is, though, isn't it, now, actually, that idea that you can get news from someone online, someone on Instagram or Twitter that you don't even know, but who has retweeted something or has read something somewhere else and posted it themselves, and how news has become almost public ownership in that kind of quite unregulated way.
Well, yes, and it's things where they know somebody inside the government, or this is not how it would work, or I worked with, I was a civil servant and I worked with them, or I was a special advisor and this is what I think, and it's, oh well, that's an opinion that I quite like the sound of, so I'll hang on to that.
Yeah, and use it again to kind of cater to their own kind of ideals as well.
Yes, definitely.
It's interesting as well, isn't it, how and you mentioned this earlier, that idea that if you express a kind of own political opinion, like Maitlis sometimes does in her interviews, that it's almost, that is seen as quite problematic as well, because obviously there's a recent controversy that most of our listeners are probably aware of, about the comments that she made about Dominic Cummings on Newsnight, and how she was seemingly reprimanded by the BBC for giving what people felt was the BBC's political opinion on the matter rather than hers. Do you think it's fair that news presenters, and in a wider manner, particularly in the UK, I think that news channels should aim to be kind of politically objective?
Well, I think, especially in the UK, it's what we would expect, I think, to have a balance of hearing from all the different political parties and across the political spectrum, so that we can make our own decisions on things. But if you watch Channel 4 News, I actually think they're just anti-government in everything they do, and it wouldn't matter who was in government. They're like, we are going to challenge and pick apart the government, and it's not necessarily an anti-conservative thing or an anti-Brexit thing, or it's just, come on, we are going to chase you and you need to raise your game. But there's ideas that, say, Laura Kuenssberg is sympathetic to the government, but then you probably have to be if you want to get access and find things out.
Play the game a bit.
Yeah, and you want, especially in the print media, if you want the leaks to come to you so you can find out about the thing that the government are going to announce tomorrow first, then you need to be sympathetic.
Yeah. And actually, you're right. Sometimes what we might think of as political opinion from a newscaster is actually them playing the system and working within the system, not a reflection on their own personal beliefs even.
Yeah, yes. Well, when I listen to Radio 5, Nicky Campbell winds me up no end, because he'll get a political person on, and from if they're from the left, he'll argue the point of view of the right. If they're from the right, he'll argue the point of view of the left. And you're thinking, no, Nicky, you don't believe anything that you're saying, or the arguments that you're making. But he's just making an argument to make the person on the other end of it stand up for their position.
There's a kind of a devil's advocate danger in that, isn't there? That sense of, my job here is to challenge you, but actually it is the issue of, well, what are you challenging here, and what is therefore your kind of public taking from what you're challenging and what's being said?
Yes.
Do you have a kind of general positive take on the news now, do you think, or do you find that increasingly news channels frustrate you, radio, TV, otherwise?
No, I love watching the news. Beth Rigby is great on Sky. I like watching a bit of Newsnight if I can. If we're not watching, Clive Myrie's done some absolutely fantastic reports from hospitals recently, and they've been fantastic to watch. Even the local news, Alex and David on the local news, and Alex in her little, from her kitchen, and talking to the local radio stations about how they've been helping people. I'll never bore of the news. And sometimes when I listen to the news on the way into school, and it's something I don't want to hear, I'll switch it off. Oh, I'm so annoyed about that. And then, but almost immediately I'll switch it back on again.
You don't want to miss out.
Exactly. I want to know what's going on in the world. And I will, I subscribe to the Times, so I listen to the BBC, I'll read the Guardian, I'll read the Times. I get the emails from the Telegraph, although I don't give the Telegraph any money, so that I can get the Daily Mail is maybe where I draw my line, but try and get my news from a variety of places, so that I can get different opinions and see how things are playing out, and different government ministers briefing to different newspapers, so you can hear all the different points of view of what's going on.
I think that's such a key
But I mainly
point,
love that in the news, in the news at the minute are the scientists, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance.
You should send your name in and be like, I'm also available, by the way.
Oh, I don't know. If it was physics, that'd be okay, but don't ask me about any biology.
It's interesting that you mentioned, actually, and I think really, really key, that accessing different news is often and should really be the only way that we access news, really, because otherwise we make ourselves vulnerable to certain opinion types or certain kind of narrow-mindedness. But one of the things that I think I pick up on a lot, particularly because we do a news day every week in sixth form, is that people often find the news really bleak and really depressing, and which is why so many people tune out of it. And I saw some really interesting articles in the New Yorker about how people are suffering, based on the kind of Black Lives Matter campaigning, social justice fatigue, and the idea that we're overwhelmed with consistently bad news. Do you think that news channels should do more to celebrate things around the world, or do you think it's fair that news is just aimed at informing, whether that's primarily negative or otherwise?
No, I think you see 24-hour news channels, you've got to watch them at the right time, and you do find not necessarily positive, but you do find programs that are informing you about news that isn't bleak. Technology news, science news, film and television news, and that's all. Sporting news is, unless it's your team is Newcastle United, in which case it's always bad news. But if you support somebody who's winning, it's good news.
True.
and but when you talk about the 6 o'clock news, they've got half an hour and they've got to tell you what the major thing is that's happening in the world, and it's often the thing that's going to affect your life is a negative thing. The local news is always a little bit more cheery. Here's a little 7-year-old that's raised a lot of money for charity, or so the schools, if you've got a good press person at the schools. The last school I worked at had very good relationships with the local media, and if there's something good happening in your school, then they have to fill half an hour, and they'll go, right, we can have 5 minutes on that good news story, that child of yours that's going to represent the Southwest at judo, or that sort of thing.
Do you think that the bigger news channels should try to do that more, though, not just regional news? Like, almost actually, should every larger news channel, for their key moment, their key kind of news night time, put something in that's perhaps more not necessarily always the kind of like lighthearted positive stuff, but maybe something that doesn't always feel quite so cynical or quite so harshly realistic? Does that not feel?
I think if you want that, you can watch The One Show. So yeah,
I like that. I've got an alternative.
Yeah. Yeah, just that we watch The One Show as well, or Martin Lewis money shows. There's sort of lots of current affairs programs that are more positive. If you need it, you've got to know where to look for it. It's just that when it's ratings, and when people are interested, when the lockdown started, The One Show was concentrating on that, because they were trying to inform and trying to help people. So you couldn't watch it and escape from it. Well, it was a big shock that they were on the opposite sides of the cameras to each other, and then Matt Baker disappeared, and he didn't even get his proper end. But now it's moved on, and they're not asking everybody how you're getting on in lockdown, and not making a big deal out of it anymore.
You're right.
Which I think is important.
There is other options for kind of positive news, and you mentioned the term current affairs, which I think people often don't associate with news anymore, because actually, you're right, it tends to be a big global political event, but sometimes we do get these lovely snippets of film or sport or science updates, which are always really exciting, actually. And I think one bone I would pick is that you very rarely get literary updates, but that's just
yes,
personal.
that's true.
With the book in general, because it is our first non-fiction book, which is a real delight, and I think as a result, sometimes non-fiction books give people a chance to take more impact from them, because they often feel more like a learning opportunity. What did it teach you about news reporting generally, but also sort of life itself? Did it have any particular life impact on you, and would you recommend it to others, and if so, why? What do you think people can get out of it?
Oh yeah, well, I did. I lent it to Mrs. Dangerfield when she was having her operation on her knee, and she wasn't allowed to get up and walk around. And I said, "You sit there and read this one," and she did, and it's I wanted to know more about how the news is produced. So it was very interesting to see some of the things are very reactive, and she has to run to places, and she gets a call and she's got to go, or she gets a call and she's got to get on a flight. But some of them are very long term in the planning. But Sheryl Sandberg, I've got a book out, so you can come and interview me in preparation for when the book is released, and that it isn't just all the work of the person on screen. There's editors and producers and directors and cameramen and everybody who's got behind the scenes that are helping that person, and they're delivering it.
All that production.
Yeah, because quite different to being a teacher, where I decide everything that goes on in my classroom. There's nobody behind me supporting me and giving me an angle. And that was interesting. And then her sort of, I've got to remember it's her opinions, but the way that she's talking about people, I think is it Piers Morgan that she's actually good friends with. So probably because they've been journalists together.
Yeah, she's known him a while, isn't she? Actually, interestingly.
Yeah, and how, when she's speaking to him, what he's like, and that's always interesting to go. Right. So Piers Morgan is more of a caricature than the one you see on the television than he is, and he is actually a clever man. Well, he couldn't be the caricature that he makes himself out to be if he wasn't a clever man that's managed to tread that line. And then the Emma Thompson interview, I was interested in, because I picked it up totally at random and just thought, okay, I'm going to read this. But the more you go through and you read the progression of the Me Too movement, and she's the one interviewing Emma Thompson, and does she talk to Bill Clinton about Monica Lewinsky, and it's not in the right context, and that's just quite interesting how you see the flow through as time progresses.
Almost like the interconnectivity of all these what seems like kind of random global events.
Yes. And then, of course, that even as a news presenter, it is random. So you are going from, there isn't a pattern to the interviews that you're doing. It's what the opportunity that presents itself, and that you are only testing the water and seeing what comes out, rather than being able to direct things. It's being on the outside. It's not being like a politician where you can make decisions that affect people's lives. You can only ask questions to help your viewers learn something.
Yeah, and maybe do something if they need to with the information.
Yes.
What do you think would be your kind of selling point if you wanted a bunch of people now, or our listeners, to go out and get this book? Why would you advise them to buy it? I
think that it's so varied in the people that she meets. There's so that, Trump, Simon Cowell, Piers Morgan, David Attenborough, the Dalai Lama, yes. People that you've heard of, people that you haven't heard of. And each chapter is like a little story. And so you get wrapped up in that, and then you move on, and there's something new to every chapter. There's something to learn.
It's almost like a good little global history sort of thing, isn't it, actually, in terms of like modern history and kind of current affairs intro.
Yes, and yeah, because she's off to Hong Kong, and she'd lived in Hong Kong, so she was able to look, and that's still going on now, the issues with China and Hong Kong. And of course, she's often in America and looking at the whole Trump presidency, and before that.
Yeah, I like that. We could kind of sell it as almost like a introduction to modern history in a very pacey, witty manner.
Yes.
I also just love the slightly punny title, Airhead. I just think that's brilliant.
Yes. Well, exactly, and she does herself down, but I think it's really good. You know, when you see the cover and she's smiling slightly, but she's looking down and looking as humble, but actually she's pretty vicious when she wants to ask you a question.
And it's just a brilliant play on words, isn't it? Airhead, that kind of joke at her being this kind of blonde newsreader, but the kind of actually on air live, like you said, very, very tough presenter as well. So I think the title should be the selling point. We can work with that.
Yes, definitely.
But it was so much fun having you on talking about a non-fiction book. It's actually been, I think, really interesting for us to kind of spitball where this takes us more topically, actually.
Yes. Because seeing if I really, the fiction books that I read are just trash. And, you know, what you can get for cheap on Kindle. And
I'm really intrigued to know what this is now. What was your version of trash? I'm like, well, tell me what it is.
Oh, you will be embarrassed because I'm reading. You won't be happy. I'm reading Mark Lawrence at the minute, and it's which is actually, it's more than 99p on Kindle, but it isn't as good as his previous two, which I'm just forcing myself through it. So I don't think I'll be doing the other, presumably other two books in the series to see what happens to Yaz. I don't know. It better end. It'll have to end really well for me to buy the next two ones when they come out.
I like that. That can be the next review of yours, is contemplating whether or not it's worth the next couple of pounds on Kindle.
Yeah. Yes. But when I buy Kindle is for fiction, and if I'm getting non-fiction, so I've got The Gendered Brain to read through that I started, but I got distracted by, I think I bought it this time last year, so I think I got distracted by Emily Maitlis' book, actually. And I've got a book called Factfulness that I must read, that Sheehan gave me. Not Sheehan, Michelle gave me. So that's next. I do like to learn all the time, and I don't have you probably do this as an English teacher and look at all the themes that are in a book, in a fiction book, but I need a non-fiction book that's full of facts that are basically saying, here you go, learn this.
Here's some information.
Yeah, because even if I don't pick up anything from the themes that run through Emily Maitlis's book, at least I can learn something more about Tony Blair or Donald Trump, or the various people that she's interviewed.
I like that idea that actually books are, I think, both a learning and interpretation opportunity, and maybe non-fiction is better for one than the other. I think that's a fair analysis.
Well, I think if you're a scientist, it probably is.
I'm going to sit here and start talking about the colour of the curtains or something in the next one, and you'll be like, oh no. Oh my gosh, well, thank you so much, Mrs. Rogerson. It was brilliant having you on and talking about such a, I think, really, really brilliant choice, actually, and hopefully one that people will pick up because you've sold it so well.
Oh, well, thank you. It didn't take me very long to go, actually, I've got to talk about this book. It's really good.
You were quick, actually. Some people dilly and dally a lot more, and you had two choices and then very quickly narrowed it down. So I like that decisiveness. Well done. Well, thank you so much for having us on again. Next week, we have got Mrs. Biggs on, our IT teacher, and she is going to talk about a Agatha Christie novel, I think, if I'm right there. So that will be another really interesting kind of run through. Our first sort of mystery one. I don't know if you've read that, Miss Rogerson.
No, Joan Hickson and Hercule Poirot and that sort of thing. I'm not
really.
watch them on the telly.
I do love some telly Poirot, actually, I've got to be honest.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you so much again, and we hope all your listeners have enjoyed it. Do give us the feedback and comments are always really, really lovely, and we hope to have you listening again next week as well. Thank you all. Take care.